All right, so we're going to choose to program in Python. So what tools do we use? There are a whole host of local development tools that you would install if you are a professional software developer. And after this course, if you're interested in continuing on as a software developer, you may install a lot of tools like a text editor. Like you'll actually have to install Python on your computer. There's some other version control tools as well that we won't talk about in this class. And so if we wanted to write Python locally on our computer, there's just a lot of tools to install and start to learn. And there's a learning curve there. So instead of using all those local development tools, which in the past I have done in this class, this semester, we're just going to use a simple tool, Google Colab, and we'll be doing all of our coding in a Google Docs style document in the cloud. So there's no installation involved, and we can get started immediately, and we will get started. We have about a half hour left of class, and so by the end of class, we'll start using Google Colab. We're going to transition now into a more hands-on part of class. So I'd like to invite you to follow along with me now as I lead you through a hands-on exercise. And the exercise that we'll be focusing on today is called Hello World, using the Google Colab notebook. So I'll lead you through some instructions live in a moment, but just to give you a heads up, for any exercise that I'm asking you to do, there's generally going to be some written instructions. So if we're doing an exercise during class, you could always get started ahead of class if you'd like to prepare. You can access the exercise after class if you miss class or if you need to just follow back. And if we're doing it in class and we're working slow and you're working through it faster, you're speed demon, you could always hopefully work through it at your own pace by following these written instructions. So that's why I try to provide some written instructions as well, but we'll be doing this together in person. So let's do it. The instructions here are asking us to actually visit Google Colab. So let's do it. We can click this link here, which is colab.research.google.com. This is like a Google Drive style doc. So I guess we can see any other notebooks in our Google Drive, but what we'll usually do is create a new notebook. If I share a notebook with you, you may need to copy the notebook that I share with you. But if we want to create a new notebook, we could do that at any time using this new notebook button at the bottom. So I'm going to create a new notebook now, and I encourage you to do the same. All right, so what is this notebook about? Let's take a quick tour. First, we can give the notebook a name using this Google Drive style, like title, name changing. And so you're probably familiar with this if you've used Google Docs before. So for this one, I'm just going to call it like Hello World, my first notebook. You can call your notebook whatever you want, but I encourage you at this time to update the title. Often, I may ask you to add your net ID to a deliverable that you may submit just to help us know whose notebook is whose, but it's not necessary. All right. Like other Google Docs, we also have some sharing settings. So if we take a look at the top right in the sharing menu, you'll see this is the way that you would share your notebook with collaborators or share it so that we can grade it. So when you submit a deliverable, I'll be asking you to do two things, and I'll give you these details again in the future, but just as a heads up for you. When you submit a Colab notebook deliverable, I'll ask you to, one, open up the sharing settings so that we can actually look at it. And so what you'll do is change it from restricted to anyone with the link can view. That opens up your notebook so that anyone else can actually look at it, and so the instructors can grade it. And then you'll copy this notebook link and then paste it into some Google form that will ask you to submit your deliverable that way. That's one way. That's one of the two things that I'll be asking you to do when you submit deliverables, is just make sure that the sharing settings are opened up and that you copy the notebook link. So this is how you would do that. The other thing that I'll be asking you to do when you submit a deliverable is to actually download a physical file. You know that docs are maybe like a file with a .doc or .docx extension. You know that spreadsheets may have like a .xl or .xls extension, and different files have different extensions. The extension for this notebook document is .ipynb, IPython notebook. So at any time when I'm asking you to submit a deliverable, also, I'll be asking you to download a copy of this notebook document, and you'll do that through the file menu. So we could say like file, download as IPYNB. So the resulting file will get downloaded into your downloads, and then there will be a place in Canvas for you to then upload that file. So those are the two ways that you'll submit deliverables. First, you'll open up sharing settings on your notebook and copy paste a link into a Google form, but you'll also download a copy of your notebook file, download it in IPYNB format, and then upload that notebook document to Canvas. We don't need to do any downloading right now. I just wanted to share with you how you would do it. All right, so that's super boring though so far. Let's keep it moving. We'll get into the important parts in a sec, but first, before we go writing code in this notebook, I'd like to draw your attention to the gear icon at the top right and encourage you to click on it. These are our notebook settings, and so these settings I think will apply to all the notebooks that you create. And so there are a few important settings that will help you succeed. I'd like to draw your attention to the editor settings specifically. And you could change the font size if you'd like, or the font family, but importantly, I'd like everyone to use 4 spaces. So in Python, the indentation level will matter. And so we could choose to indent with 2 or 4 spaces, but let's choose 4 to be consistent. Importantly, I think it's very helpful to show line numbers. That way, if you want to take a screenshot of some code, if you have a question about it, I can say, oh, look at line number X and do that there. So it'll help us help you. If you've enabled show line numbers, showing indentation guides will help you make sure that you use the right indentation levels in your code. So I think that's a helpful setting as well. Code folding can help you expand and collapse certain parts of the code. So we could, for example, like just not focus on some of the details. We can collapse some of the details sometimes. And I think those are the important settings that I'd like for you to configure. So we'll definitely want to save those settings. There may be some fun miscellaneous settings like putting on core G mode. I'll just do this very briefly. We'll see what happens. These are some fun settings, but they may take up more memory. So use at your own caution. Let's see what the core, we might see some like dogs running around at the top. Here we go, core G mode. Anyway, so a little fun settings, but anyway, not the point. Let's keep it moving. Core G is distracting. Let me take it off. All right. Anyway, so we looked at the gear icon. We set some text editor settings. We looked at the sharing settings, and that's all good. Some other things to note are the left sidebar, and we'll be using this left sidebar a lot. If I give you a notebook that has like a document tree, you'll see the outline here by clicking the table of contents icon in the left sidebar. And I'll just actually start fleshing this document tree out. So I encourage you to follow along with me now as well, as we give our document some like heading levels, essentially the same as we could do in like Google Docs if you wanted to make like heading level 1 or heading level 2. In a Python notebook, we have 2 kinds of parts of it known as cells. And we could create a new code cell a few ways, but there's these buttons here to create a new code cell or new text cell. We can create a number of new code cells. a new number of new text cells, move them around using these arrows. And so it will be important for us to know which cell we're writing in, because the text cells will write some text in there. And it will also respect a language known as Markdown, which I'll introduce to you now. We'll write that in the text cells only, and it will respect our Markdown syntax or just normal English. But the code cells, that's where we'll write some Python, and there's a specific syntax that we will be using with Python. So it will be important to know, well, are we to use the right kind of cell? The other way to add cells are if you just kind of hover your mouse in the middle of these cells, you'll see you could create a new code cell or text cell this way. So we can create a number of code cells or text cells. I'd like to encourage you to create a few text cells at the top, and we'll be writing some English in here. So in one of them, you could just write a sentence like, hello, this is our first class, or something, whatever you want to do. You could see that some normal English, that's all good. We'll write that in a text cell. If we want to write headings, we'll start using the Markdown syntax. So I'd like to share this Markdown cheat sheet with you, and it will tell you some ways to provide a little bit of markup to format the text that you write in a text cell. So there's a link in our exercise to the Markdown guide, and I want to encourage you to visit this, and I'll copy this link in Slack as well. It's a shorthand way of us writing HTML, but I know not many of you are probably familiar with HTML. Basically, let's see, do we have a get started or basic syntax? Yeah, so if we look at the basic syntax, we can see how the Markdown on the left will look. So we can achieve different heading levels by using in Markdown a # character, either one of them for a top level heading, or two of them, or three as we go down. So this is how we'll create a certain organizational structure in our notebook. So for example, we could use some # as heading characters in Markdown in our text cells. And I'd like to encourage you to see if you can use a single level heading, like top level heading, for example. Here, there's a space between the heading and this # character, which in Markdown will display our heading as a large text. In the next text cell, let's do a second level heading, 2 $, and this is our second level heading. So we can start to assemble like a document structure, and we see that in the table of contents that's respecting our document structure, just kind of like a Google Doc. All right, so that's a little bit of working in Markdown. To complete our very brief tour of Markdown, I'd like to draw your attention back into our exercise, where we see there is some more example Markdown there for us to copy. So back in our exercise, once we scroll down past the instructions, we'll see this example Markdown. And I'd like to invite you to copy this example Markdown from our exercise. In GitHub, if you want to copy this code block, there should be like a ability to copy it using this button at the top right and just paste it in. Otherwise, you could always just kind of select all the code and copy and paste that way. So sure, we were messing around with some text cells, but let's create a final text cell and paste in this Markdown code. So other things we can do in Markdown are create lists using characters of choice and some indentation. That will create a bulleted list. Importantly as well, links. There's a certain syntax that we do that. We'll use like square brackets around the link text and then parentheses to denote the link URL. So here's some examples of links and other Markdown things. And if we want to put a code block in our Markdown, we could use the triple backticks, like triple backticks, like print hello, for example. which is some Python code. And when we put this inside triple backticks in Markdown, we see that this is formatted as a code block. So at this time, we've just been exploring the Markdown syntax as an optional way for you to spice up your text that you may put in a text cell. We have about 10 minutes left. We're doing great. We will finish by talking about code cells, and we'll run the code, and then that'll be it. So far, we've just been focusing on text cells, and you may want to use them to explain or introduce some of your code, share links, give instructions, provide context about what someone will be looking at when they view your notebook and run it. But anyway, now let's focus on a text cell, a code cell. So somewhere at the bottom, I'd encourage you to create one or more new code cells. And in these code cells, this is where we'll put Python syntax. We'll start learning Python either next class or the class after. So we'll revisit Python definitely over the next few classes, but in our exercise, I provided you with some example Python syntax. So I'd like to encourage you to, from our exercise, scroll down to the bottom and copy this final code block of some Python code. So I'll copy it and share it with you in Slack as well. And so we'll just paste that in a code cell. And you'll see that it's like syntax highlighted a certain way, which means that our code is being recognized. So we have some code now in this code cell, but we haven't yet run the code. The way that we'll run any code cell is by using the play button here. So after you have some code, we'll just click to play it or run that cell. And the first time it might take a minute, but now our notebook is warmed up. And now we should have quick responses. So we'll start getting into, well, what is this print statement about and what can we do in Python? But this is some example valid Python code. And you'll start to see that the print function, its role is to output some kind of message. And this is helpful for us to display messages to a user, as well as it's helpful in debugging. If we want to figure out if something about our program is not going well, we can always print to debug. What you'll also see here in this Python code on line 7 is that we're just using Python to do math. So Python, it's a calculator, great. And we know we could do math, but we'll return to more Python next class. If we want to reference any variables that have been previously defined in a code cell, we'll first have to run that cell like we just did. And now, because this cell has a definition of our variable x, we can now use or reference that variable later on below in cells below. So at any time later on, we could say like y equals x times 10 and then print y. So the reason why we have access to x here is because we've already run the cell where x is defined. If we try to do this again, like say like z equals y minus 1, and then maybe in a cell below, we try to print z. If we just run this cell that tries to print z, before we've actually defined it, we'll see an error because z, that variable, is not in the notebook's memory until we run the cell that contains the definition for variable z. So if we try to run things out of order, we may see a name error, and you may see a name error if you're trying to reference some variable that doesn't yet exist. So if you see a name error, just check the order of things. Make sure you run cells above. And once you do, now we'll be able to rerun that cell, and z will now be in the notebook's memory. So without getting too much into it, that's where I think I want to leave off on an intro to Python notebooks.